It was too big to be called a sword. Massive, thick, heavy, and far too rough. Indeed, it was like a heap of raw iron. This is the exact description that the late great Kentaro Miura gives us when describing the most iconic weapon from his masterpiece of a franchise, and it's hard to argue his logic. One look at Guts' Dragonslayer will tell you that this thing does not have a practical weapon design in any sense of that phrase. It's longer than Guts himself, about as wide as him as well, and even lifting it is a bother for many characters in the series, let alone swinging it the way that Guts does. But this brings us to the topic of discussion for this video. How exactly does Guts swing the Dragonslayer? What kind of training does he do? What kind of food does he eat? And what kind of juice does he drink to get this Super Saiyan level of strength where he can hurl about what appears to be at least 100 kilos of solid metal as if it were a rag doll? And of course, can you, dear viewer, ever accomplish that same feat? Stick around to the end of the video to find out. It was created as a gimmick to draw in new readers, but it ended up becoming iconic instead. The inspiration behind the Dragonslayer. Before we get to the in-universe reason for Dragonslayer's creation, let's give you the author's reason first so you can understand how the weapon evolves between its first appearance during the prelude chapters of Berserk and its first canonical appearance in chapter 93. Despite crafting a story that has gone beyond its rather straightforward prologue that mostly featured Guts blowing stuff up and spouting badass lines in the face of mortal danger, Kentaro Miura has admitted that coming up with the design for the Dragonslayer was him sticking to a formula. That being, drawing in new readers with something out of the box. Before Miura drew the Dragonslayer, massive, unwieldy swords were not popular amongst fantasy manga authors, though there were series like Gwyn Saga and Pygmalion that featured large swords in their stories, and in fact, the author of Berserk was directly inspired by the character of Kurt from the latter series, and a scene he has with a blacksmith for many of his scenes between Guts and the creator of Dragonslayer. But at the same time, Miura felt that those swords were simply drawn large, and no attention was paid to the actual handling of such a massive blade. The situation has clearly changed since then, because these days it's hard to find animes that don't have at least one Dragonslayer knockoff in them, especially if it has an epic fantasy type setting. In fact, the design of the Dragonslayer evolved between the prototype Miura created for Berserk and the actual first chapter of the series itself. In the prototype, Dragonslayer has a more angular design, with the blade sort of starting with a wide base and then tapering off into a width that is more associated with the sword today. In the final draft of the first chapter of Berserk, Miura removed that angular design and turned Dragonslayer into a straight up slab of iron that doesn't just cut things, it butchers its way through their bodies. The first time we see Dragonslayer come out to play is when Guts corners a bunch of thugs that work for the Snake Baron at an inn in Koka City. Up until that point, he had already shown off his arm cannon and his arm crossbow, so the huge sword grip we saw strapped to his back became an afterthought, until one of the fallen thugs decided to jump him. Guts avoided getting ambushed with a single stroke of his sword, which ended up bifurcating the man in two, a testament to the strength of both Dragonslayer and Guts himself. The rest of the prologue is a whirlwind of death and destruction, but the one thing that stands out in amongst all of it is the Dragonslayer, and not because of its cutting power, mind you. People know this sword as the ultimate big sword of all time. It's massive, it's thick, it's like a slab of iron. The author says so himself. Yet in the Black Swordsman arc, the size of the Dragonslayer hasn't quite reached that iconic status. You can see it in the panel where Guts draws it for the first time, but when it's actually unsheathed, it appears slimmer than the Dragonslayer we know and love. This is probably because the blade's design evolved with the series, just like Guts's. When we see Dragonslayer for the first time, its base is about as wide as Guts's upper arm, but just barely. It is also a sleeker blade, more straight than tapering, with less definition to it than its later iterations. As Kentaro Miura's art style evolved, so did his character designs, and while it is certainly noticeable with Guts, it arguably has a larger impact on his sword. It was created to kill literal dragons, but its creator did so off of pure instinct. The reason behind Dragonslayer's unusual design. In chapter 93, we see the Dragonslayer for the first time in canon, and it leaves quite an impression on us. Rickard stumbles across it in Godot's shed, and it towers over him, as it is at least 1.5 times his full height. He wonders what this absurd monstrosity is when Erika names it Dragonslayer. Fun fact, this is the only time someone refers to the sword by its name, but to be completely honest with you, Dragonslayer isn't even the sword's proper name. It's just a reference to its creation story. Thankfully, we didn't have to wait for that for too long because just then, Godot strides in on his intruders and decides to drop some history on. A long time ago, when Godot was still young and a master blacksmith working at a lord's forge, a king sent out a proclamation for a sword fit to kill dragons. Now, it's no surprise that nobility likes their weapons about as decked out as themselves. You need only look at the ridiculous battle-aversive armor designs of some of the characters from the Song of Ice and Fire series to know that in fantasy, as in real life, the lifestyle of a noble is all about pomp and circumstance. It's exactly the kind of thing Guts can't stomach, and turns out, neither could Godot back when he himself was young. He'd grown tired of making weapons for nobility who always demanded more refined, more elegant, more elaborate detailed blades than swords that would actually work well in a battle. He felt as though his creations had lost the essence of what they were supposed to be doing. A sword is meant to cut through your enemy's life, and the exact proclamation that the king sent out was a sword fit for butchering dragons. And so, Godot designed it as it was described. He labored day and night, working steel into a massive cast that ended up becoming the mold for Dragonslayer. The end result was the iconic behemoth that we now see Guts fight with on the regular. But the thing is, in his pursuit for expressing his creative genius as an unparalleled blacksmith, Godot ended up going overboard with the sword's design. He made it so massive and weighty that it was practically useless for humans, and he ended up escaping with his life from that kingdom for his folly. He kept it locked up in his shed because, in his mind, the sword was useless too. What good is a sword that can't be lifted? But Rickert was still curious. Could the Dragonslayer actually slay dragons? This is where Godot's inner cynic shines through as he tells Rickert that it probably could if there were any dragons around in the first place. Dragons were fantastical beasts that were dreamt up through imagination. They weren't real. And besides, a dragon was called a dragon because a human could not hope to defeat it. Godot had no idea that the astral world existed, and that in a couple hundred chapters or so, real dragons were going to appear all over the world. And because he had already dismissed his creation as unworthy of use, he forewent offering it to Guts and forged him a more practical sword for his travels instead. This sword held up well against regular steel and could even cut through an apostle's hide at the first attempt, but it broke on the second, leaving Guts wide open to lethal attacks. He managed to avoid being killed by the Hound Apostle by blowing him away with his arm cannon, but the pressure sent him flying as well. As he recovered from his fall and mentally cursed Rickert for putting too much gunpowder in the shot, he glimpsed what was going to soon become his best friend. Guts walked out of Godot's shed like a black beast and immediately butchered the Hound Apostle into two, chastising Godot for holding out on him. He called Dragonslayer perfect for his hunt, and Godot was shocked to see Guts was even able to lift the sword, let alone wield it properly against such an inhuman opponent. Dragons are called dragons because humans can't kill them, but what do you call a human who hunts dragons? You get the idea. The final version of the Dragonslayer is a much more imposing one than the one we saw in the Black Swordsman arc, simply because it's been buffed up in size. The Dragonslayer's base in its final form is far wider than it originally was, with the blade tapering towards the tip by quite a significant margin. In the original design, though the tapering is evident, it isn't as steep as it becomes post-Chapter 93. Another thing that can show you this subtle size difference is the fact that Guts uses the second version of the Dragonslayer as a shield as well. During the Lost Children arc, we see Guts use the flat of his blade to protect himself from Rosine's pseudo-apostles multiple times. Guts can hide his entire body behind Dragonslayer at a certain angle, which would have been impossible for him to do with the original version given its lanky build. But now that we've explained to you the reason behind Dragonslayer's creation, both in real life and according to canonical lore, let's get around to answering the questions we've posed in the title of this video. How does Guts swing the Dragonslayer so effortlessly, and can you do the same? He's got a lifetime of practice and training, and that's the bare minimum you're going to need. How Guts swings the Dragonslayer, and why you probably can't. Ever since he walked off into the dark night, willing to face evil devil monsters with nothing but the weapons on his person and the rage burning in his heart, Guts has survived death more times than he can count thanks to Dragonslayer. This sword, which has become just as much a part of him as his prosthetic arm, is what keeps him going, and we mean that on a spiritual level as well. In Chapter 48, Guts Guts realizes that because he has only known the way of the sword since he was old enough to remember, he would commit himself to becoming as great a swordsman as he could possibly become. He would challenge opponents stronger than himself, test his mettle, and admit defeat only after he had left it all out in the field. Little did he know back then that his dreams would start becoming reality soon enough, but in the worst ways possible. Still, his dedication to his swordsmanship shines through with his daily drills, where he swings his sword 200 times in the same manner just to perfect his moves. And this isn't something he does just with Dragonslayer, it's something he's been doing since the age of 6, which is one of the reasons why Guts can wield that slab of iron in the first place. Let's put things into perspective for those of you who might not be aware of just how much of an inhuman feat it is to swing this sword around properly once, let alone constantly using it in battle. Though there is no official height or weight ever mentioned for the Dragonslayer in the manga itself, there are a couple of things that can point us to just how heavy it might be. The first thing is the fact that when Guts was temporarily captured by the Holy Iron Chain Knights, it took 2 of them to transport the Dragonslayer, and they weren't exactly breezing through the task either. Now, the Holy Iron Chain Knights aren't exactly a fighting force, it's mostly comprised of the sons of nobility whose title of knight is just that, a title. It's a ceremonial force that is mainly deployed during inquisitions by the Holy See. So it is natural to assume that the 2 Holy Knights who carried Dragonslayer to Farnace's tent weren't quite as built as you'd expect them to be. The standard for lifting weighted objects at a workplace in the United Kingdom for the average male is capped at 25 kilograms. This is done primarily to keep workers from injuring themselves, and it's true that a human being can lift far more weight than that. But this is a good way to gauge just how heavy Dragonslayer can be. It took 2 people to carry Dragonslayer to Farnace's tent, so that's at least 50 kilos right there. Double that, actually, considering how much they were struggling to lift it. That's the bare minimum estimate. There are dedicated threads on Reddit, skullknight.net, and other online Berserk forums where people have gone into the minutiae of the Dragonslayer's actual height and weight. The one number that comes up pretty often is 200 kilos, but we don't think that's entirely accurate. Estimates that are closer to 100 kilos are far more realistic given what we've just told you, but hey, we're not calculus students. We're just trying to break things down for you guys. Now, lifting something that heavy is usually only reserved for multiple people, or one person who has specifically been training to lift said 100 plus kilo object. In all the time we've seen Guts in Berserk, we've never seen him doing boulder presses to build more muscle mass. Everything he has is from his sword training and actual combat experience, but even then, Guts is considerably jacked. He's well over 6 foot tall according to most estimates, and weighs nearly as much as his sword. Also, all of that is muscle and scar tissue, especially after he becomes the Black Swordsman, because Guts is constantly fighting for survival during that phase of his life. The canonical reason for Guts being able to lift Dragonslayer is rather simple, and some might even call it unrealistic, but we don't think that's the case. See, Guts has always been fighting with swords that are far too big and weighty for him to wield perfectly. At the age of 6, he learned how to fight with a regular arming sword. Now, that might not seem like too big of a deal for you, but try giving a 6-year-old a butter knife and see if it doesn't manage to hurt themselves one way or another by the end of the day. Guts, on the other hand, was forced to face a brutal onslaught as part of Gambino's training, and not only did he manage to weather the storm, he also landed a hit right back at the guy. An arming sword weighs just over a kilo and is anywhere between 45 to 80 centimeters in length. Even if the sword that Guts used to train with Gambino was on the shorter end of that spectrum, it's still far too big for a 6-year-old to be carrying around, let alone wielding in an honest-to-God mercenary sword fights. But after that first practice session where Gambino cuts Guts' nose, giving him the iconic scar we know and love, he resolves to train daily and become a better swordsman by any means necessary. At that young age, Guts develops his daily routine of swinging 200 perfect swings in an attempt to master a weapon that should technically not even be fit for him. And 3 years later, it appears as though his efforts have already started paying off. When we see Guts fighting in a siege battle at the age of 9, he's carrying a bastard sword on his back, which is considerably longer and heavier than a regular arming sword. A bastard sword is also called a hand-and-a-half sword because, as you might have guessed, it's about the same length as 1.5 times its wielder's arm length. It also usually weighs around 1.5 kilos, making it far more perilous for a user as young as Guts, who could have been knocked off his balance just by not handling his sword correctly. By the time Guts joins up with the Band of the Falcon, he has started wielding a two-handed greatsword, which is nearly as tall as him and should weigh around 3 to 5 kilos, give or take a kg. This sword was the one he used to defeat 100 Tudor knights, Griffith, and then Wild, but it didn't last for too long beyond that. The Dragonslayer is about the same length as Guts' previous two-handed weapon, but it's weight, as we've already mentioned, makes it a bit of a problem to use. Given its sheer size and weight, Dragonslayer is often referred to as a blade maul rather than an actual sword. We're pretty sure that this description is the reason for that infamous clanging soundbite from the second Berserk anime, but let's not get distracted by that right now. Usually, a maul is shaped in such a way that the tip is where most of its weight lies, because that's where its head is supposed to be. Most of the maul is just the handle, but with Dragonslayer, that's not the case. It's at least 100 kilos of castle-forged iron that has been shaped into a blade at least 6 feet in length and about as wide at the base as Guts' torso. Because he's been swinging heavier, longer blades his entire life, Guts being able to wield Dragonslayer makes more sense than it should. And as for the weight issue, well, there are two factors that help him optimize the usage of this weapon, namely his fighting style and his prosthetic hand. Before he becomes the owner of the Dragonslayer, Guts has a more fluidic fighting style that maximizes his body's power and movement to cause devastating damage to his enemies. With the Berserker armor, he becomes far more tactical in how he fights. For instance, take his fight with Zondark. Yes, the Dragonslayer is slimmer than how we knew it to be during this arc, but even when Zondark unleashes his faster than the eye can see flurry of offense, Guts uses Dragonslayer to simply block the attacks, not all-out parry them like a regular sword fight. He often uses one quick, brutal swinging motion to cut through his target, and during his Black Swordsman days, that's targets most of the time, as in multiple people, spirits, and horses. R.I.P. to the fallen ponies. When he's going up against Rosine, he smartly uses the flat of his blade to flatten her pseudo-apostles into wasp soup, as we've mentioned before. And then there's also the fact that his left prosthetic arm is magnetized for the sole purpose of making sure Guts doesn't lose his grip over his sword. This detail is often forgotten in amongst his other innumerable feats of strength, but Guts' left arm being able to magnetically hold onto his sword basically eliminates his need to support the blade on swing with his left wrist. He can focus solely on how to control it with his right, and that's why he delivers the terrible finishing blows that he does. And let's not forget the fact that Guts still continues with his 200 perfect swings a day ritual even into adulthood, as we see him practicing his slashes in Elfhelm right before Skull Knight shows up. Is it possible that the Dragonslayer makes him have to activate every muscle he needs to use to swing it to its absolute limit? Absolutely. But we also have to remember that Guts has been doing this since practically day one, so it really isn't as much of a struggle for him. As for his insane reaction times with the sword, well, that once again comes down to his skill as a swordsman. Usually, Guts assumes a forward guard when fighting with Dragonslayer because he knows that his enemies will most likely attack him head on. He only takes it behind his head when he knows for sure that his strike is going to connect the way he wants it to. Otherwise, he moves the Dragonslayer around without lifting it so much as lugging it about. One particular instance where his reaction time comes in incredibly clutch is during his fight with Rosine, where Guts managed to block her supersonic stinger attack at the last possible moment by turning Dragonslayer to its flat side. His instant thinking and insane battle experience told him that Rosine was aiming for his head the moment he realized she was moving too fast for him to see, and that last moment sword flip quite possibly saved his life. He has also used the Dragonslayer to block arrows by using the least amount of effort to guarantee the most effective solution. It isn't just his brawn that makes him such a dangerous fighter with the Dragonslayer, it's also his brain. And when he wears the Berserker armor, all of this theoretical physics goes out the window because then his body is operating at its maximum possible potential. You can find out more about what that means in our video explaining why the Berserker armor is the most dangerous weapon in anime history, but the gist of it is, the armor removes the natural limitations that pain receptors place on the human body, allowing its user to break through that ceiling and function at inhuman speeds and strengths. Berserker Guts is able to easily wield Dragonslayer with one hand and leap about with it as if his body were made of rubber. So there you have it, the basics of how Guts can swing the Dragonslayer and why it makes sense as far as his personal history is concerned. But can you, dear viewer, become strong enough to swing this sword around like Guts does? Well, the answer depends. Are you willing to become a strongman? Because if yes, then our response is it's likely possible that you can. Superhuman feats of strength aren't exactly as rare as we think they are. One Google search can reveal to you dozens of names of professional lifters and strongmen that have deadlifted about 5 times the purported weight of the Dragonslayer. The world record for deadlifts is currently held by Half-Thor Julius Bjornsson, better known as the Mountain from Game of Thrones. Thor performed a 501 kilogram deadlift back in 2020, for which he was awarded a Guinness World Record, but that isn't quite as impressive as what he did with the Husafell stone the year before that. Hafthor carried a 186 kilogram boulder, which is an important part of Iceland's culture and heritage, for nearly 100 meters whilst holding it chest high. A deadlift is performed while a person is stationary, so it's tough to gauge just how well a person would be moving around with that kind of weight in their hands all the time. The Husafell stone strongman competition is a better comparison. Now, generally speaking, stones are less dense than metals, and so lifting a rock and a piece of steel that weigh about the same is going to feel kind of off. That's because one of them is far denser as a material than the other. Even if we were to make adjustments for the Husafell stone in comparison to our estimates about the Dragonslayer, their actual lifting impact in terms of weight alone should just about even out. Of course, there are many other factors to consider, like the specific type of rock the Husafell stone is made out of, how does it offset against actual iron, yada yada yada, but we think you guys get the point we're trying to make. Now, can Hafthor Julius Bjornsson lift the Dragonslayer, a sword that is just as tall as him and weighs about as much as he does? The answer is yes, and he would probably be able to give it a good couple of swings too, but that's about as far as he'll go in our minds. See, in the end, Berserk is a piece of fiction. Yes, it has a lot of realism in it, but for a piece of fiction to work, it needs to be able to make you suspend your disbelief. As far as we're concerned, Berserk more than accomplishes that, because at no point do you really question how Guts can lift this sword that's supposed to be unwieldy by design. Apart from all of the reasons we've given you guys, this one is perhaps the most pragmatic, but hey, our comparison for whether an average human could swing this sword ended up concluding that even one of the world's strongest men might end up failing where Guts succeeds. So, you know, the struggle continues. Marvelous verdict. But as for this video, we're afraid that's gonna be it. The Dragonslayer is one of those weapons that has been the subject of much speculation and admiration over the 3 decades of its existence. Some people think it's too unrealistic, others think it's too overpowered, but everyone agrees that it is the pure, unadulterated embodiment of a badass anime sword. When you see a massive sword being used in any media franchise from now on, be it a video game or a movie, you're probably going to think about Dragonslayer now that we've put it into your minds. But don't thank us for that, thank Kentaro Miura instead. As for us, we would like to know what you guys thought of the video. Let us know if you think you could swing Dragonslayer in the comment section down below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you guys in the next one. Until then, keep struggling, fellow strugglers.